All right, well, good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me all right. We're going to get this panel started. I think people are still coming in, but we're on quite a tight time slot, so we're going to get started straight away. So welcome to this panel on the inside story on cybersecurity, perspectives on governance and privacy. Cybersecurity is clearly in the news a lot, and I think Paul Polman of Unilever mentioned it this morning in his address as well. One of the most recent companies to have been hit by this is British Airways, when it said customer data was stolen through an attack on its website and app. But there are numerous examples of companies I could mention: JP Morgan Chase, Home Depot, Equifax, Target. They've all suffered data breaches or some form of problem. The World Economic Forum has once again got cybersecurity in its top 5 risks to companies this year. And cyber attacks are costly to repair. They can disrupt operations, they can damage a brand, they can lead to fines. A study this year found that the average cost of a data breach is something like $3.9 million, whereas mega breaches, which is when more than 1 million records are lost, can cost up to $350 million to deal with. The introduction of GDPR in Europe in May is also pushing investors to take an interest in this issue, as companies can face a fine of up to 4% of their global turnover, or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. Disclosure is lacking in this sector a bit. A report by the PRI this year found that. However, a study by Schroders on sustainability issues found that only 7% of investors ranked cybersecurity as the most important area to engage on, and that's well behind the top scoring areas of corporate strategy or climate change. So what priority should investors be giving this issue, and how should they be engaging and pushing companies? We have a panel of esteemed experts here who can share their expertise with you. I'll talk you through them now. Rosa van den Beemt is a senior ESG analyst and engagement specialist at NEI Investment, which is Canada's oldest responsible investment mutual fund, and she covers healthcare, IT, telecom, and engages on cyber. David Sneyd is vice president in the governance and sustainability team at BMO Global Asset Management, where he also covers telco, media, tech sectors, voting in North America, with a focus on cyber. And both David and Rosa are part of the PRI Advisory Committee on Cybersecurity and are engagement leads for the collaborative engagement on this. Annabelle Nelson is the head of credit market relations at Prudential, where she looks after the credit side and ESG issues, so she's responsible for addressing queries on cybersecurity, so she's kind of our corporate representative on the panel. And Scott King heads advisory services at Rapid7, a software security company, and he's worked for the US Department of Defense. He's been a chief information security officer of a large energy company before being at Rapid7. My name is Peter Cripps. I'm the editor of Environmental Finance magazine. So we're going to talk through some of these issues and leave 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So do think of some questions that you can ask, and we'll be tweeting under the hashtag of PRI in person. So perhaps a good way to get the panel going would be to ask Scott to give us an intro, a bit of a scene setter, by giving us an example of a case study where something has gone wrong. So Scott, why don't you give us a horror story to kick the panel off?
Nothing good comes from horror stories. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of destructive-based attacks that have happened over the years. Who here has heard of Stuxnet? So Stuxnet started off in 2010. That's when we discover it. It was an attack on Iranian centrifuges, right, for their nuclear production. So that was a really interesting attack because it was the first one that I can recall that was really public that actually had a kinetic world impact. Moving forward a little bit, in 2015 and 2016, there were kinetic attacks on Ukrainian power utilities that impacted, between about 230,000 people for about 1 to 6 hours, depending on which one it was. The one in 2016 was a carryover from 2015, and how these things work is really interesting. I'm not going to talk about those two necessarily, but what I am going to get into is something that just happened last year in 2017. So has anybody heard of a particular attack called NotPetya? A few people in the room? Okay. So what ended up happening is there was a piece of malware called Petya, and what Petya is it's a ransomware malware. So it encrypts computers and forces you to pay a ransom or wipe all your data. Now, NotPetya basically presented itself in a very similar way in the sense that it presented itself as ransomware, but even if you paid the ransom, it didn't decrypt the computer. So it was very destructive. It was intentionally destructive in nature. Now, what ended up happening is this malware, and the reason why I talked about the Ukrainian situation first, is because there's a group of Russian cyber actors that have been named Sandworm. So that's this hacking group out of Russia. And what they've been doing is they've been going out and they've been compromising different aspects of countries and nations and companies that reside in those nations for geopolitical purposes to cause kinetic world impact. Now, this particular study was really interesting because the way that NotPetya worked is it actually leveraged a vulnerability that the U.S. National Security Agency had been using as part of one of their tool sets, which leaked just prior to that, called Eternal Blue. So what ends up happening is this malware comes into a company's network, and because of an inherent vulnerability with all of the company's computer systems, it propagates, just like we used to see in the early 2000s when worms were a huge epidemic in the cybersecurity space. Now, I was in the community at that time, so I saw these things. Maybe others did not, but worms used to be a thing of the past, and NotPetya actually created worms being a thing of the current state. So that was kind of interesting to me as a person in this space. So what ended up happening is a company that basically makes accounting software, much like Intuit does in the United States. This company makes TurboTax-like software that you have to have installed in order to file taxes and whatnot in Ukraine. At Maersk, which is obviously a huge shipping and logistics company, they had one computer in their company that had this software installed on it. The cyber actors, the Sandworm group, they infected this accounting software company so that when an update was made to their subscribers, to this software company's subscribers, it also installed this malware that then went and propagated throughout all of these companies' computer systems. There were lots of companies that were impacted by this. It broke through geographic boundaries because, again, cyber is something that transcends nations, it transcends companies, it transcends countries. So the net result of this is that for Maersk specifically, it knocked out about 4,000 servers and took 45,000 end-user computing devices, like that laptop that you're using right there, sir, brick. Cannot use them anymore. Completely locked up, data's gone, everything's out of there. So I've got a couple questions that come out of this, but from a financial impact perspective, just this one attack and all of the different entities that were impacted by it cost an estimated $10 billion in overall damages. So there's a couple companies that were not listed or not really talked about in this attack. The pharmaceutical company Merck was impacted by reportedly $870 million worth of damages. FedEx, $400 million worth of damages. And then Maersk themselves, $300 million in damages. The worst part about this for me as a cyber professional is this is not the first time that we've seen this type of attack, this destructive type of impact to corporations. In 2012, we saw a company called Saudi Aramco. They were impacted in a very similar way. And I don't have the final financial figures on that one, but they also were impacted by having 35,000 computer systems immediately turned into bricks overnight. So just think about that for a second. What would your business do, or what would the company that you're representing do if all of a sudden you suffered an attack like this? Do you have adequate backups? Do you have people that you can rely on to respond to this? Have you practiced these types of responses? And more so than anything else, do you have the right leadership in place with the right skill sets to even detect when something like this happens? So just some questions, some food for thought to kick this panel off. But the intent of this story isn't to scare you or to freak you out. It's to talk about what can happen and how you can think about this from a risk management perspective, because it's not just so much about the immediate impact and loss of data, but it's about the long-term systemic effect that happens from the result of a breach like this to your reputation, to your customers, to your shareholders, and ultimately to society at large.
Well, thanks for that, Scott. You have scared us and freaked us out, in fact. But no, you asked some very good questions there. So let's turn to Annabelle, our corporate on the panel, and ask, so what does happen when a significant cyber event is uncovered at a company? What can companies do?
Sure. Well, the first point is, are companies alive to the issues, the risks that they face, and the vulnerabilities, and where? And is this something that is a key part of the focus from the board and across the organization? Does the board understand the risks? Is there sort of appropriate governance and processes in place? And are they tested to see whether they work? Because cybersecurity, cyber resilience doesn't exist purely in the risk department or in information security. It is across the whole operation, whole enterprise. And every member of the enterprise has a responsibility. Because ultimately, we're here to serve our customers. And if we are hit, the vulnerability is to the company, but also the harm is to the customers too. So when a cyber event happens, the first question that is asked is it important? Because sometimes a cyber attack happens and the impact is relatively small. The next question is, how does it affect us? Does it directly affect our operations? And the third question that must be asked is, will it hurt us? And the hurt, as Scott very neatly outlined, isn't necessarily the financial hurt. It's the impact on our customers. Apologies, can you hear? It's the impact on our customers. The real impact for financial services is around trust. We're a trust-based business. And if our customers are impacted, it's their data. We have obviously a financial impact and business processes may be interrupted, but it's a loss of trust from our customers and their willingness to engage with us. And there are huge opportunities that digital technologies bring, sort of social opportunities. For example, we operate in Asia, where many of the markets we operate in, there are relatively limited, or some of our customers have limited access to primary healthcare. So we have provided an app, which is effectively a doctor in the pocket. If we have a cyber breach and there is a lack of confidence from our customers, there's going to be a lack of willingness to make use of the tools and the social benefits of online diagnostics. So it's a society as a whole won't get to realize the benefits of digital technologies. So that's the key challenge.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Annabelle. So we'll move on to what investors can do to engage with companies to ask for better governance on all of these issues. But before we move there, there's a more fundamental issue I'd like to ask our investors on the panel, and that is that cybersecurity, it's been controversial and it still is discussed whether this is actually an ESG issue. Some people, are still confused. Why cyber? What to do with ESG? I mean, what do you think of that, Rosa? Is this an ESG valid issue?
Yeah, I think that Annabelle actually already touched on the most important thing here, which is a customer trust. And so I think when a big data breach happens, it's really clear to all of us as investors in the room that it impacts the financial situation of the company, and it really hurts the investor. Actually, the British Airways breach that you mentioned, Scott, I think the share price fell about 4% the day that the breach was announced. But share prices fall also because company reputations are at risk. And I would say actually that research has shown that consumers in the healthcare and consumer and financial spaces consider really moving their business elsewhere if their data has been compromised. So there's that issue of consumer trust. Then, of course, something that we look at as ESG analysts is the issue of privacy. And I think that is always important to keep in mind that privacy is a fundamental human right under the UN Declaration. But sometimes I think we we should also look at the more emerging risks that also have a social impact, but could have a more severe impact. For example, Scott, you mentioned perhaps attacks on certain infrastructures that could really damage people's lives. And so I think for ESG analysts, is cybersecurity an ESG issue? This is one of the most easiest and clearest example of an ESG issue.
David, do you agree?
Yeah, no, certainly. I'd be out of a job if I didn't. I think there's, and I know a lot of people have been doing this, a lot of sessions, it's a bit of a cliche, but I would draw a comparison a little bit to climate change, which I can't believe I just said that, in terms of there's something about the nature of the subject which is just now part of society and businesses operating within the world in which we're in, being interconnected, but also I think sometimes it's important to bring this back to basics. And cybersecurity, it sounds very high tech, but actually often the motivation and how it occurs is very low tech. And so is also the solution. And often calling it high tech can put this air of mystery about it where we think we can't fix it because it's too out of reach. But ultimately, this, in a lot of cases, it's either a case of, it's the latest manifestation of how criminals make money at the moment. They'll effectively go where it's easiest. From what I last saw a couple of years ago, the trade in personal data surpassed the global heroin trade for the first time in value. And so it's quite helpful for us to think of it in that respect. And then I think a lot of what Scott was talking about as well in terms of actually nation states are now seeing this as a real avenue as to how to tackle it. And just on the human rights point, I just say that GDPR was initially, when it was formed, a human rights piece of work that was then later extended to effectively loop in crime enforcement. And we now see it as very much a sort of data privacy issue, but really the whole heart of what it's trying to do is look at data and try and shift, I think, those of you in the last session before this, data, is it purely a commodity that can just be harvested irrespective of who it is about or what it is, or is it a much bigger issue of data stewardship in terms of acknowledging that it's not just numbers and data points, but actually it concerns individuals' lives and a right to privacy, which again to some extent is quite culturally sensitive because that's different for us in the West as well as elsewhere in the world. But there's something about, is it just something there that's for the taking, or is there something bigger than that as to actually how that should be handled and the risks that can be derived from that?
Good. Okay. Well, you've both sold me on the ESG debate. So what kind of information should investors be looking for in order to be assured that companies are managing these risks? Perhaps Rosa, you'd like to.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, David and I were both part of a PRI collaboration engaging companies on cybersecurity governance. And really interestingly, actually, the collaboration had over 50 signatories participate, which is, I think, the second largest collaboration that the PRI has seen after the Climate 100. So clearly an issue that's forefront in investors' minds. But what we focused on specifically is, because we're not cybersecurity experts, we're really approached it from a governance angle, and with every type of risk, of course, if it's material, there are governance procedures in place that's how you ensure that the risks are adequately overseen and managed. And so there were a couple of areas that we focused on: policies and strategies. What are the types of policies that companies disclose? Do they have a data privacy or protection policy? Do they disclose actually whether or not they aim to comply with privacy laws? But then I think more importantly, we looked at board oversight and how is cybersecurity risk overseen within the board or within a specific committee of the board, and often we found that was the audit committee. We also looked at whether or not there was sufficient director skills available on the board, and if a board would see the need for better cybersecurity knowledge on the board, were they actively recruiting directors that had that type of knowledge, or were they providing education for the existing members on the board? And then, of course, we looked at the lines of communication up to the board and what type of metrics get reported to the board. who is in charge at the company at an executive level of overseeing those types of data and privacy risks.
Yeah, I would just add that this is one area where I found that engagement has added an incredible amount of value. Of all the companies I've talked to over the last year or so, none of them need convincing about the materiality of the risk and the fact they should be prioritizing it. I think most companies are to some extent aware of it. I think one area that they really don't know what to do about is actually how to disclose on this area. And I think, it's fully understandable. We're talking about a security topic at the end of the day. So, you don't want to give them away all the secrets. And at the same time, going the other way, companies are very aware of not wanting to boast in any respect in terms of being secure, because that makes you a great target for people who, want to take down those people who really think they're good at this stuff. So I'll just give a quick example of a company we've been engaging with as part of the collaboration. It's a UK, one of the largest grocers in the UK. And even in terms of their ESG strategy, which they put out earlier in the year, they listed a series of things about what they wanted to do. And as you can imagine, for someone like that, it was concerning water use and supply chain. And for each one of these things, a metric and target was attached. And then almost as a sort of footnote at the end, it was like, oh, and we're also going to be a market leader in cybersecurity and really, really knuckle down and figure it out. And that was it. And we sort of said to them, well, you tell us nothing more than that. All we know is your ambition. We don't know anything you're doing against it. And coming back to what we found is actually companies need to be aware of the sort of things we are looking for as investors. Effectively on this and so many other issues, we are outsiders to the business, and we are trusting those inside the business to manage it on our behalf. So it's that process of doing that we're really concerned with. And we find often that, in that particular case, we got very good access talking to the guy in charge of all of this internally. They do everything that we would want them to do and seem to have their house in order. And we basically just gave them a transcript of the conversation and said, well, there's nothing particularly sensitive in here. You're talking about the governance arrangements, the reporting, how it is the information flows around. And as investors, these are the things that we really want to hear about. You don't have to worry so much about giving away all your secrets. And we're not interested in almost to what extent which encryption you're using. Again, we're not cybersecurity experts. What we're really looking to do is understand that the risk is seen in the magnitude that it really is, and it's integrated throughout the business in how it's managed.
So, to just kind of further underscore the role of the board and some of the challenges that I've personally seen, I've got two kind of interesting stories. They're very short. First one is the first time I ever went and talked to a board of directors, I was terrified, right? Because I'd never done it before. So I didn't know what they wanted to hear. I didn't know what I wanted to tell them. I didn't want to bring them metrics that were very technical in nature. So I spent, a couple weeks at least preparing this board presentation. I vetted it with my boss. I vetted it with his bosses. I vetted it with everyone I possibly could. Got it down to where I thought it was going to be perfect. I walk in. We start down this conversation. We had about 20 minutes because that's generally about what a board will give for a cyber presentation. And what we ended up talking about was nothing that I brought in with me. It was about one of the board members had read something about a new vulnerability in their iPhone, and they wanted me to tell them all about it. So we spent about 20 minutes talking about iPhones and smartphones and technology vulnerabilities. So that was an interesting anecdote. That conversation eventually changed and got much higher level as more people started becoming familiar with the topic. But it was terrifying to me. You go and talk to them, but we ended up talking about something I knew very well that I hadn't prepared for at all. Second story is, in my role at Rapid7, I talk to customers all the time at all different levels within an organization. I talk with chief executive officers, I talk with chief information officers, security leaders, all up and down the organizational hierarchy and food stack. And we also do a fair amount of board briefings for our customers as well. One of the things that I just heard recently was a security team told me that, because I was asking them about what do you talk with your board about, how do you communicate your cybersecurity posture, your risks, things like that. And they said, well, what we do is we run a vulnerability scan and we produce these metrics that are deeply, deeply technical metrics. So if anyone's ever seen a vulnerability scan, it's stuff that's really hard to understand, even for a security person. And they send that to their security leader, who then creates some charts in Excel, and then they go in and talk in detail with their board about it. And I'm just sitting here thinking to myself, your board has no idea what the hell you're talking about. How are you going to translate this into potential for financial impact? How are you going to translate this into terms that they can understand and relate to? Now, fortunately, I can help them with that, clearly, but the reality is that that company and that board are so far apart from their security leadership and from what their board is able to understand. You have to come back into the middle, and having dialogues like this is exactly around what we do as kind of a community of investors and as professionals to have those dialogues around what impact cyber has to a corporation and what a board's level of responsibility is for that.
Can I just add something to that? Actually, an interesting anecdote from one of our engagements with a big telecommunications company that also specializes in providing cybersecurity services. We asked them what type of metrics were reported to the board, and they said that they didn't feel comfortable noting all of the metrics, but one that they could share was, whether or not a breach was material. And so we asked them, well, what does that actually mean? What do you define as it being material? And they said, well, we take the SEC definition, so whether or not it causes an investor to choose not to invest with us or to divest. And that just doesn't seem, there is just such a gap between the actual cybersecurity metrics that make sense and these types of metrics, which, if an investor doesn't choose to invest with you, how do you know that? So.
I had an interesting observation as the corporate in the room on the receiving end of investor queries. I've never yet met an investor that didn't say they wanted more disclosure. And at the moment, our annual report runs in excess of 420 pages per year, plus we do an ESG report, plus we do detailed solvency analysis. We provide a lot of data. So a key part of engagement is understanding what is it investors want. So it's incredibly helpful to us when investors reach out and say, hey, tell me about XYZ, tell me about your approach to cybersecurity and resilience. Because it means I get an insight as to what you care about, and I also get an insight into how well we are telling our story. Because if we're not telling you the information that you need to assess our business, then that is helpful. And we change. The other piece that's really important on investor engagement is, and David alluded to this, no company should be complacent in this area. And every company will say this, but we're a learning organization. So when we have investor engagements, a key part of it is a two-way dialogue. Because if you guys see best practice, that's something that I, as an investor relations who understand our story and at high level what we do, and it's something that's new to me, I want to hear about it, because maybe this is something that we can feed back into the organization. Maybe it's something we do already and I'm not aware of it, in which case I can explain it better in the future, or maybe it's a new learning opportunity. And in terms of what the board receives, investors are always asking, how does the governance work? What do you see as the risks, and what do you do about it? And the key part of the governance is boards are humans too. Paul Polman mentioned it this morning. Boards tend to be of a certain age and have a certain background and perspective. So but boards are really good at challenging experts. So a key part of governance is that there is clear information flows and escalations. And that the data that's provided is transparent and intelligible, so simple. And it's also consistent, so that they can see the changes, they can pick it apart. And the other quite relevant observation, Scott, that you made is boards are interested. So when things get escalated to the board, it may be a two-way piece. It may be that the board members have experienced it from an issue from other companies, or that they've heard something in the news. So the challenge is very much a two-way dialogue. And good governance is all about transparency and clarity of communication and accountability.
As we heard earlier on from Scott, I think that some of these reports are very technical and are probably incomprehensible to a non-IT professional. So Scott, does, or maybe the investors as well, do boards need to have an IT expert, or do they, and what is the right governance structure? Do you need to have one IT expert, or do you need to know that most of the board are IT savvy?
Yes.
Right.
So my personal perspective is that there needs to be somebody that understands the bridge between technology, cybersecurity, and risk management that is part of a board. Depending on the size and makeup of the company, I think it becomes more and more critical the larger the organization is and the more complex that they are.
So one person on the board is okay, just as long as you've got one board member who gets it.
I think that that's the minimum. I mean, clearly that information is going to extend out because every single board of directors that I've ever spoken with, the level of interest is huge. And I've seen boards where there's one person that is the expert advisor, and they often come from industry, and they are experts. They are recognized experts. You Google their name, and they're all over the place. But I've also talked with boards of directors that don't have that expert, but they are still incredibly interested. And from my experience, people that sit on boards of directors are incredibly intelligent, smart, with it people, and they get these things and they understand it. But having that advisor that they can turn to, that they can trust, that they can get unbiased information from is absolutely paramount.
I just wanted to add one small anecdote. When we were talking to a company board about the expertise of the directors, they said, well, we have one clear cybersecurity expert on the board because they used to be a board member at Target. And because, at the time that Target was going through their massive breach, and this director has learned so much from this process. It really has learned what not to do. So I thought that was an interesting perspective, perhaps a little bit different than the type of expertise you were talking about, but they thought it was very valuable.
Yeah, one thing I just add is it can be a challenge when it comes to technical and operational knowledge, but also someone being able to be an efficient board director. So, board directors are it's not necessarily always as clean on boards as here's my allocated so-and-so, here's my allocated so-and-so. That can be knowledge that can be somewhat spread amongst a few, and often the response we get from companies is, well, so-and-so used to run a healthcare company, or they used to be on a board with a financial services firm where the regulatory environment and the requirement around them means that through their time involvement in that business, they would have at least gained an appreciation of the level of threat and the appropriate kind of mitigation. And in terms of competent directors, you're hoping that they are generally aware and are good at understanding the risks to a business and then planning accordingly. That's a universal skill to some extent. One thing we have seen is in an effort to not have to necessarily dilute the role of an individual director by somewhat elevating a particular skill is advisory panels or ad hoc groups or committees, or they have lots of different names where you don't necessarily get caught up in all the fiduciary duty and the legal responsibility that comes with being a company director, but the principle is that is a group of experts who are available to the board at any time. They will often have a regular session, and that can be 3 or 4 experts, which is effectively a sounding board, so that you'd hope a director would be humble enough to know where possibly there is some lack of knowledge, and effectively they can go ahead and draw on their expertise without necessarily worrying about getting boards that's 25 people, because we need to have an allocation of kind of each different risk in the business.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left before we'll turn to the audience for questions. So do think of some questions, and you could get an opportunity to ask these experts. So we heard from our 2 investors that you've got this engagement initiative with the PRI going on. Can you give us any results? So you probably can't give anything quantitative, but some anecdotal evidence of how it's been going. Have investors wanted to talk to you on this? I mean, companies want to talk to investors on this, because that's one thing that I hear a lot, is that they're not really that eager to converse.
I'll just quickly reference just that example I gave earlier of the company we spoke with, the UK grocer. And they were actually very receptive to our feedback, and particularly the work that the collaborative engagement has produced, which I'd encourage you all to read, in terms of just general areas that we appreciate disclosure on. And so we've got a timeline with them over the course of this year, in the hope that with next year's reporting, we're hoping that we'll see more from them in that kind of area as they sort of step out a little bit more on disclosing on that.
And I think that the overall engagement collaboration has been quite successful. Most of the companies that we reached out to actually met with investors. We were talking the other day about how difficult it is to engage with Amazon, but we did manage to secure a meeting with them on cybersecurity. Not that they were very forthcoming with specifics, but that was a starting point. But I do think that the greatest challenge that the collaboration had was really pushing for that disclosure. And so there are a couple of success stories, but we're not there yet. And part of that falls back on the fact that companies say, well, we can't really disclose certain sensitive information. And I actually wanted to ask you, Scott, about this, because a cybersecurity expert told me, well, if that's the answer a company gives you, that's kind of an indication of their immaturity on the topic. What's your take on that?
I think that based on what I've seen in my career, a lot of the information that a security leader or a security team would want to present to their board is muted. So it's not so much that the board isn't interested in having the conversation. They're not being presented with all of the facts in many cases. Oftentimes, actually, I can speak to a couple situations where I've heard specifically from board members that they don't want to hear about anything that's good that's happening. All they want to hear about is the bad stuff, the stuff that worries you, the stuff that keeps you up at night. That's a very progressive, kind of forward-leaning type of conversation that really speaks to risk. But I would agree with the expert that you spoke with that generally that would indicate a level of immaturity, but there also could be other factors going on there as well, in the sense that all of the information may not be getting to the people that are interested in it. So if you are on a board, I would highly encourage you to demand, in some cases, to actually speak with the security leaders directly without having many other people in the room. Now, you know what's going to happen behind the scenes. That security leader is going to be heavily prepped. They're going to have all their talking points. They're going to be heavily vetted. But having that relationship and having that dialogue, I think, helps really bridge the gap between what a security leader is able to talk about just from a kind of a skill set perspective, right? Because it's not easy to necessarily take deeply technical things and translate them into terms of financial impact. And it also helps that board member understand the type of world that the cyber professional lives in. Just one metric, there's a company out there, I won't name them for obvious reasons, but they receive about 1 million email messages a day. Of those email messages, 93% of them are either malicious or unwanted. 93% of 1 million emails. That's a tremendous amount of email that technology has to either filter out, but also leaves a gap in the ones that end up getting through. And that's where everybody in this room comes into play, as we were talking about earlier, about your role and responsibility in this equation. So you also have to some degree, learn what's expected of you and how to spot these types of things as they're happening within your own environment, both at home and at work. And what that translates back into is broader awareness, broader knowledge, and overall a level of maturity that comes up significantly.
Yeah, I might just add that's the one bit of the picture we haven't really talked about much yet, in terms of if you look at really where is a company the most exposed, it's not the board and however 20 people there are, or senior management, or even the IT team. It's effectively the tens of thousands of employees who are interacting with these things regularly every day. And statistics show that up in the sort of mid-90s%, most of the time these things occur through that kind of avenue. And one of the interesting things that came through with GDPR was it was very much trying to introduce a cultural change. So you have this idea of privacy by design, data minimization, It was trying to go beyond just purely, okay, have your data protection officer, here's the reporting line, this kind of stuff. It's actually, as an organization, how are you thinking about the way that you look and handle data? Coming back to my earlier point on, is it just purely a commodity to be harvested, or is it something actually about people and linked in that respect? And so therefore we do ask questions about employee training, and I'm sure all of you have probably worked somewhere where you've had your own company try and do phishing scams on yourself, and then you click on the button thinking it's a whatever, and then suddenly the IT department laughs at you because you fell for it. But it's all part of a process of trying to make you more savvy on actually, effectively that is the first line of defense most of the time. Going back to my earlier point, it's not always high tech, it's often low tech, it's socially engineered through electronic platforms. So actually having employees who are understanding of that and who are skeptical and prudent is very important.
So I'd just like to follow on that, those observations. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of days about companies having a clear sense of purpose and that being a key driver of the corporate's culture. So lots of companies talk about being customer-centric, but a key part of that is understanding what that really means. And it's changing a mindset to being every person in the enterprise is employed for the purposes of the customer. So whether you're in a group head office role like I am and you're several steps removed away from the end customer, or whether you're down paying out claims or selling products, we're all here for the customer. And so when we are developing cyber resilience, that's also because it's enabling our business model to better meet our customers' needs. As we become more digitally enabled, we have to be a more agile company, being able to respond to our customers' needs when they want it, what they want, in the means that they, in the manner that they want to receive the product or the engagement. Becoming more digitally enabled increases the risk of threat, the risk of vulnerability. So it's very important that the people who are running the company, me, the employees, you guys, understand your responsibilities and your accountabilities. So we have a very detailed and tailored training program, and every single employee in the company has to undertake, amongst other training, cyber resilience. And for GDPR in Europe, it was specifically aimed at that, but we also have across our operations in the US and Asia. Every employee had to do that and attested, and had to complete training and attest. And the results of the training was a key MI point filtered back up through the reporting chain to the board. Because they want to understand, is this actually being done? You referenced, to what extent do the board have an opportunity to interrogate the security leaders? I mean, my company, head of information and security, who obviously I spoke to ahead of coming here today, talked about it's a formal requirement. Every quarter he goes and sees the board and they interrogate him. And he describes it as a joyous experience. But that's formal and diarized. But then there is the informal traffic as well. Because board members, senior leaders, they're exposed to this. We understand that for us, cybersecurity it's a sustainability issue because it's absolutely integral to the trust and our customers and all our stakeholders, not just our customers, our distributors, willingness to engage. And this extends both within the enterprise but also with our third-party suppliers, because we need to have comfort that our standards and requirements are actually being met by our suppliers, the other parts of our other partners that we depend upon to deliver our business.
Just a quick question before I open it up to the floor. So we will have, there's a hand over there already, I think, if we have a roving mic. But just a quick question for our investors before we do that. What are you really hoping to achieve with this engagement? Because we've heard that you're not, with the best will in the world, IT experts, you're ESG experts, so it's more governance. Are you really thinking that you'll change corporate behavior, or is it more just about getting them to disclose more?
I think it is, in part, corporate accountability. I think in this age where data is increasingly becoming currency, companies have a responsibility to be responsible data stewards, as David already mentioned earlier. And so, as investors, we can do our part in hoping to move towards a more responsible data environment. But to do that, we do need disclosure. So there's, I think that it's not one or the other. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say the big picture of what I'd hope for is for companies to no longer see this as an operational risk, to see it as a key business risk and treat it accordingly. And I think also, just to mature the conversation as well, I think there's still a lot of fear and shame around this whole area when it comes to companies from a reputational perspective. And actually, we just need to accept that it's not if you're hacked, it's when you're hacked. We often say to companies, well, when this happens, we never try and use the phrase if, because we're beyond the point of if now. And I think people need to, the businesses need to accept that, and investors need to accept that, and we all need to have a maturity to say, okay, let's maybe put down the blame game for a little while, and actually, I think if we can have a mature conversation about this, we can make sure that resilience is built. And ultimately, we want comfortable companies to be comfortable to admit where they may not have necessarily done things. And so, to all their credit for British Airways, it's been a long time since we've had a company that's had such a fast turnaround between a breach occurring and it not being leaked, or it not being revealed 6 months later when they've done all the work behind the scenes to try and mitigate it. For the fact that occurred, I think there's some credit due for the fact they've put their hands up and said, this is still work in progress, we can't give you the whole picture, but we want to tell you as soon as possible, and we're committing to try and work with you to try and resolve this.
Okay, we had a question in the audience there. Can you please say who you are and where you're from as well, please?
Jason Masters from Uniting Financial Services in Sydney. It's probably going to be a bit of a long one in the sense I want to give you some context where this question is coming from, a comment and then a particular question. So in 1987, I co-authored a book with RMIT University, the first ever study of computer security at a national level, and to the best of my knowledge, still the only one. 2 years ago, I gave a speech at Massey University in New Zealand. If I took my recommendations and just modernised the language, the recommendations were exactly the same. So effectively, in 30 years, nothing has happened. When it comes to directors, again, interestingly enough, in other countries, things are happening. So in Australia, the Australian Institute of Company Directors has a post-company director specialist course on cybersecurity. And in Canada, at McMaster's University, which is their leading company director education, they have a half day. So I think things are happening. My question particularly for the investors, if I go back after the release of my book, I was very critical, and I'm now showing my age, of when Compaq Computers launched their tower computer, that they didn't build fundamentally a security framework in that technology. If I look at all the technologies being involved, we're always retrofitting. When are we as investors, when we're investing in technology companies, actually going to demand that they actually build security and protection up front, rather than forever, ever doing it retrospectively, and it can never be done retrospectively?
Yeah, I think that's, again, coming back to GDPR, that did introduce the principle of privacy by design. So one of the things that required of companies is to effectively do assessments of what personal information is required for any product that they're doing, and obviously the discretions with management as to where that threshold is, and that's something we do ask about. And for some companies that we think are a bit more ahead on this, they're doing that effectively with anything that they're doing. So we have to do this assessment and build it in. And I think more and more we're seeing a growing acceptance of retrofitting. It does not work. It's a space that moves so quickly. And so another question we ask, for example, is on your product development team. What's the relationship between them and your tech team? Is there actually a member within that team who is not just design and marketing and all these kind of things, but is there actually a representative there? Or is it more that they are looped in towards the latter stage of development? And I think hopefully that is going to be a cultural shift for a lot of companies in terms of how they operate. And I think going back to the session we saw earlier, there's a lot of thinking about how do we kind of break these things down, and it's almost like, well, let's do it now and let's think about the consequences later. So there is a degree of learning there on slowing that down and trying to flip it a bit and planning ahead, and hopefully, at least for those that it's applicable, GDPR will sort of slowly start to introduce that as an industry norm.
And I would actually add that the FDA in the US has been looking to for ways to pre-certify certain companies, particularly in the healthcare space, on their cybersecurity and data infrastructure. So if these companies can prove up front that they have secure flows of data and manage cybersecurity issues well, that they might not look at the security per product, but would pre-certify any type of product that a company would release. So Johnson & Johnson, for example, has been involved in that process because they actually had a medical device, an insulin pump, that a researcher found a vulnerability in. Nothing had happened to any of the patients, but the company basically sent letters to every patient that was using the insulin pump to make sure that they knew how to secure themselves in case something did happen, and then implemented the privacy by design process for all of their medical device operations.
Thanks for that. Any other questions in the audience? We have another hand at the back there.
Hi there, Victoria Barron from Newton Investment Management. Other than having an expert on the board, which I rarely come across boards who actually do have a cyber expert on their board. What red flags can we as investors take note of or look out for when we're speaking to companies? Because it's at the end when there has been a breach that we actually found out that there's a problem. And to the point earlier about concerns over disclosure because it might be commercially sensitive, you're kind of just left in the dark. So what sort of red flags and indicators should we be monitoring when going to speak to a company and a board?
Great question, thank you, Scott. Actually, it might be good to hear your view on that.
Just a couple things from my perspective. So when you're interviewing these companies or interrogating them, as it may be, some basic questions to ask them. Ask them questions like, have you had a third party review your cybersecurity practices? If the answer is no, huge red flag. Ask them if they have dedicated cyber professionals within their organization. And depending on size, they may or may not, but if they're a larger company, especially in the Fortune 500, if their answer is no, huge red flag. The other question I'd ask is really along the lines of training and awareness and how they do and perform and how frequently and how much money they invest in that cyber awareness training. And I would also ask them for, potentially even metrics, depending on how deep you want to look, about how much that training is penetrated into their entire employee population and how they measure success. So, a couple of the things that I've seen companies do from a kind of pre-asset M&A perspective along those same lines is you'll go through the governance structure, because governance really provides a good framework and a required framework for understanding and determining what cyber protections are necessary. And then it moves down into the effectiveness of that governance program. So doing things like third-party assessments of that company show you how effective they've implemented that governance posture as it relates to cybersecurity. And then you get into kind of the last end of that, or the third leg of that stool, which is, have you been breached? Have you ever had a company in here to do a compromise assessment to see if there's any indicators that you've been breached in any way, shape, or form? So I would kind of ask questions along those lines, and based on the answers, you're probably going to get some no's, some maybes, some sort of, some, yeah, we've got a guy or a gal over here that's our cybersecurity person. You really have to kind of talk about the credentials of that person, what their background is, and how their role is supported by executive management. My experience has shown that executive management will talk oftentimes about the importance of cybersecurity, but it's not something that's woven into the fabric of their culture, and that's also something that you would look for.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions I go to when I'm staring a CEO in the eyes and to look into their soul. And I guess the first one is, I say to them, would you say that you're fully secure and resilient to a cyber attack? To which if they say yes, that's an instant red flag. Either they don't know what they're doing or they don't appreciate the risk. That's a real bad one. The other one I say is, just out of the blue, you can say, okay, well, when was the last time you were attacked? And that's a really good way of judging the comfort level that management has about talking about the fact that they have been attacked, and therefore the story that comes with what they've done about that. I think, again, coming back to, they might well say, well, actually, we haven't, which would then make me question whether the line of communications are there and whether they really know. But also, if they're very uncomfortable talking about it, then that's a good test to probe a bit more of, well, is that because they haven't fully got their house in order here? The first reaction is quite a good way to kind of read that off.
There's another interesting element, which is, how do companies think about what resilience is and the key tools, key inputs into delivering resilience? And I sort of simplistically say there are 3 areas. One, is a company able, when it's under attack, to make quick decisions? Does it have plans in place, tools to implement them, and people with the skills who can implement those plans? Does it have capacity? Because resilience is about being able to withstand an attack and not be taken out by it. And capacity is around having, if a part of it, as we heard from NotPetya, if a part of a business is attacked, is there capacity elsewhere within the group to stop business as usual and respond? And the third element is adaptability. Is a business able to respond and adapt its process and be agile so that that doesn't get attacked in a similar way in the future? And there is a natural tension here from an investor perspective, because capacity is not necessarily the same thing as efficiency. Because you have spare resource, you're not as lean as you could be. And a key question for investors to consider is, how do companies bridge that tension? Because we're all compelled to deliver return to our shareholders, investment return. So there is a natural tension here. So it's an interesting one to see how companies respond to. Certainly, when I'm asked the question, it's an uncomfortable one, but it's a true response. Is the funding for cybersecurity and cyber defense, is that a P&L? Is it a variable to meet budget, to meet P&L? And the answer is, in my company, no. And that's because we see it as such a big sustainability issue. So that's my 2 penny.
So we have a minute on the clock. There's probably no time for another question, is there? No. Okay. Well, so I think just in order to wrap up, my takeaways from the session is that, cybersecurity is clearly material, clearly an ESG issue for investors as well. But it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because investors are not IT experts, so it's mainly in the governance side of things where they can perhaps have the most impact, but they are clearly engaging more regularly, as we've seen through the participation in the PRI's engagement initiative on this. And I think we've heard some very good guidance today on what are the kind of red flags that investors should be asking as we look at this issue going forward. So, but it's clearly a dynamic issue, and probably come back here next year and they will have changed perhaps, and there'll be more to learn on this. So perhaps you can help me by thanking the panel, and thank you very much.